Phil fails at philosophy. What the heck could it be? Life, such a mystery. Phil fails.
But I do, I think this is an interesting thing to think about when we're talking about doing philosophy or any of these kinds of tasks. We do, and I see this with, again, my students are often just like, they'll try to read Descartes or Plato or any of the other things that we read together, and they'll be like, Professor, this book's terrible.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh my God.
It's no fun.
Yeah.
I don't know what this guy's talking about.
Well, I'll just start off with, I read this whole chapter one and then a half times. Yeah. And at no point did they answer this question.
I know.
At no point did they answer this question.
Right. Yeah.
I was like, what?
One, I think that's part of the game, right? You're not going to get clear answers. That's not the goal usually, right? It's not to say, all right, Philip, hey, look, here's the answer to this complex question that people have thought about for 3,000 years.
Yeah, why don't they just put it in the first sentence?
Right, here it is.
Here's the answer.
And then you don't have to read anymore. You know it.
This could be a simple chapter.
Right, because
it should just be like, just put it in big font.
Right.
If you want to have a lot of pages.
Yeah, I think these writers have too much respect for you as a human being to do that.
They want me to get there on my own.
They want you to maintain your autonomy as a thinker.
Oh my God.
And think through it. And also
that's a part of one of the Western sides, like having that autonomy or that agency. He talks about agency is a primary part of whether the virtue theory or maybe even the deontological theory was this like first you find agency, then something else happens.
Right. Right. I think that was during the deontology. But yeah, I think it's there in all three.
Let me first say the question a couple times. Because they said the question a couple different times and in a couple different ways. It was how we should live happiness, human flourishing, and the good human life. How can I be happy? How can I live a fulfilling life? How can I find my purpose? How exactly can I achieve my ultimate end goal? How should I live my life? These all kind of living a morally appropriate human life.
Good work.
Those were all of them because it seemed like they were asking this question a bunch of different times.
Yeah, that's a really good way to tackle this. He says this is about how should we live.
Yeah.
Right? Whether that was his question or the question of the editor, like it's always that kind of question too.
Yeah.
But whatever the case is, but figuring out what he's getting at, going through and say, well, how does he rephrase this question? What does he think we're actually asking? Which I think is actually one of the more important ways to go about doing philosophy, is to really think about the question.
Yeah, what is being asked here?
And is this the question I want to ask? Is this the question I intend to ask? Am I thinking about this right? Have I got the right terms formulated?
And it seems they started by saying this wasn't, which it wasn't this like new how to live a happy life thing that we see in our culture.
It's not
like how do you wake up emotionally like happy in the morning or that sort of thing. And that isn't the question that we're asking.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think he's saying like, look, we're asking a bigger question.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe the answer is that sort of subjective sense of fulfillment that we associate with the word happiness.
Yeah, subjective well-being.
But I think he's partly what he's pointing to is like, hey, people who have thought about this, when they talk about happiness, like when Aristotle talks about happiness, what we translate as happiness.
Yeah. Was that eudaimonia?
Yeah, eudaimonia, right. He's not talking necessarily about this thing you think of when we think about happiness if you're following kind of our basic conversation in our culture
Which is
now.
what they said was emotional reports about how happy, content, or satisfied one feels right now.
This sort of subjective, I'm happy, I'm not.
Yeah.
Both traditions use this term happy, being happy.
Yeah.
Both to get at what they're trying to figure out and to undermine the sense that our immediate answer, I don't think it's just modern Western people who think our immediate answer is that subjective sense of well-being. I think people around the world for generations, have been happy in that way, that kind of emotional happiness, right? And that sense of fulfillment, that sense of accomplishment, whatever it is that's that like, I feel good, pleasure, right? That internal sense of pleasure. I was a graduate student and I was interested in understanding Buddhism more. I was studying it academically. But, you know, I think as a good scholar of religion, you learn early you got to go out into the field and see people doing this stuff, right? You can't just read books and think you understand it. So I would go to a lot of different types of Buddhist teachers around Philadelphia at the time who were doing Dharma talks and whatnot.
Yeah.
And you know, maybe partly it's that they were speaking to primarily a middle-class white American audience, right, in those venues. But they did tend to start off with, like, you know, what is Buddhism about? It's about achieving happiness, right? And then let's talk about what happiness is and make that more complex.
That's something you and I share. I, at a certain point, did the mindfulness-based stress reduction program, which is John Kabat-Zinn's kind of like meditation for well-being. And after that, I didn't do it for academic purposes, but I found myself going to the Austin Zen Center,
right,
and then Appamada, and then, like, you know, Mariposa Sangha, and then the Thich Nhat Hanh, the one called the Plum Blossom Sangha.
Plum Blossom, yeah.
And I found myself really taking a real survey of Austin contemplative practice communities, and the only thing that kind of stopped that was COVID. I learned a lot from a lot of Dharma talks, and
I mean, part of why I'm interested in this book is because I do think, you know, the Buddhist tradition is this amazing, coherent, right? It is in many ways less fragmented than the Western tradition, but it is this tradition that at a very early point takes reasoned discourse. At the end of this, if he does give an answer, he basically says, well, you got to meditate. Right? Because isn't that, I mean, I don't know if you got to that part.
The Buddhism part?
Yeah. But at the end, he's kind of like, well, this is how Buddhists approach it. And Buddhism is awesome because it creates this space for contemplative practice as a vital ingredient in moral life, which is
that would make sense.
Not there in the Western, like at least in the three traditions he's identifying.
For this chapter, we're talking from the Western part, Socrates, Aristotle.
Yeah, that's who he's really...
Kant, Immanuel Kant, and Mill.
Right.
And from the Eastern side, it's Buddha's on all of them, but he talks about how Confucius also has opinions on this, and Lao Tzu.
Yeah, and he basically tries to organize it. And it's interesting because we do this partly because we're not as familiar with the Buddhist tradition, is we tend to talk about Western philosophy like it's these individual thinkers who produce things. Yeah. And then when we get to, say, Indian philosophy, we're like, well, there's this school, and it's kind of a little crazy, right? Because it'd be like as if we never talked about Marcus Aurelius and just talked about Stoicism, right? You know, like, and it's a habit of mind that says they're a culture, we're a bunch of individuals working things out. Right?
Because we're immersed in this one.
And I think it's partly just that. Like, it's a tradition that is so deeply wed to our political traditions, our intellectual traditions. When he's talking about Aristotle, Kant, and Mill, right? He's talking about three traditions of ethics, right?
Right. The virtue theory, deontological theory, and then just consequentialists.
Consequentialists or utilitarianism. Yeah, we can use both.
But just in speaking of this chapter in general, I had this sense that it had a lot of fluff in it, and I'll explain that really quick because I thought, here, we're exploring this question. And then we kick it off with Western philosophy started with pre-Socratic people like Homer and Hesiod, and they believed in supernatural causes. And then after that, we got to the pre-Socratic people, and they believe in natural causes like water. And then we got to, the sophists, and they believed in, what does any of this have to do
with this question?
I feel like, are you teaching? Why do I need to know all of this? I felt like we could have just dealt with the question, who he was going to use to talk about the question, so I could just focus my energies, because I felt like I've got a limited amount of RAM to bring to this discussion. Why are you filling it with a history of Western philosophy that takes us up to Socrates?
Right.
And then we start past Socrates at Aristotle. Which,
right.
I mean, I think Aristotle and Socrates are real similar, as Aristotle was a student of Plato, right?
Yeah.
I'm even in for that. I'm like digging towards these facts or something, maybe to impress you, or maybe just to impress myself that I can like hold these things. But why isn't any of this stuff important?
How are we asking this question? Are we asking this in the like rhetorical, why is this important? Can we just get past this? Or are we asking this in the earnest, like, why is this important?
Yeah. Well, I'm asking it. Well, part of it comes to me from a place of maybe frustration.
Right.
You might sense that in my voice. Like, why are you pointing my attention towards this? How is this important to this question? And I would remove the emotion of it and say, is this important to the question that we're asking? And I guess priming me to think about it through the narratives and the theories that you're going to present immediately after. Does this in any way, shape, or form help me to be a better thinker or a better digester of knowledge?
I think the historical context of questions and ideas are absolutely vital, right? The question is, this is a book that, like, as you read the introduction, you can see who are they thinking of as their audience.
But are they going to do this for every question?
Yeah. Well, let me finish my thought here.
Okay.
Yeah. And they're kind of like, they're talking about the book primarily like, hey, we're writing this book so that if I'm teaching an introduction to philosophy class and I want to make sure that it's not just an intro to Western philosophy, this might be a good book to have students read, right? And so there's a certain level of like academic work I think they're trying to do, right? That would be part of a class. Like,
okay.
So I think that's part of what's shaping this is that.
So this sets up the whole rest of the book.
Right. But that's maybe. I mean, like because when we get a book like this, it seems like a coherent whole, but really what happened is this editor solicited 8 manuscripts and then tried to put them together and figure out which one should come when. Yeah, and I think maybe, I don't know if they're going to do this every time, but I think maybe part of why the editor may have chosen to put this one first is for that reason.
To teach us.
Like, here's some of the basic outline of these two big traditions, right? And I think that still doesn't answer your question, because whether it's in the book or in an intro to philosophy class, why is it important to know all these details?
In order to consider how Western thought and Buddhist thought answered this one primary question.
So if you were going to just accept that it's important,
yeah,
what would your answer be? Why would that be important?
Oh, man. Why would it be important? I'm gonna have to put down a little bit of my frustration first,
Yeah.
in order, which I don't want to do. Okay, okay. Putting down. I'm gonna take this out of here. I'm gonna put this down here.